Okay, we're recording now.
Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the March 18th, 2021 meeting of the Ad Hoc Committee for Revision of the Mamaroneck Code of Ethics. Is there a motion to open the meeting, convene the meeting?
I make a motion to open the meeting.
There a second? All in favor, say aye. Aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Any opposed? The meeting is now convened. Is there a motion to approve the minutes of the meeting of, should be singular, meeting of March 11, 2021?
I make a motion to approve the minutes.
As I should say, edited by Ellen and me. Is there a second? I second. Is there any discussion on the edits to the minutes? If there is no discussion, all in favor of approving the minutes of March 11, 2021, please signify by saying aye or raising hands.
Aye.
The motion is carried. The minutes are approved. Thank you. The second item on the agenda is the status of the mailing of the ad hoc committee letter to Village of Mamaroneck employees via Power DMS. Nora, can you bring us up to date on that?
So I'm gonna check with Jerry again tomorrow because I think it seems not to have gone out because I didn't get it and you did, nobody on the committee got it, so I think we would all be considered employees. But I'm gonna double check with Jerry tomorrow, and I just put a note on my computer to remember to call that tomorrow.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you. If the I should say March 18, by the way. If the letter does not go out sometime in the next, let's say until we meet, before we meet next week, then I think we have to take some kind of very public action. If the most efficient way of reaching the Village of Mamaroneck employees is through this email, I believe it is, and the email has not gone out, then we've been meeting since October, then something more drastic action has to be taken. Not sure what that is, whether it means directly contacting the mayor again, or Mr. Fusco, and saying what's going on. But this is kind of embarrassing at this point.
Well, I don't think it's the clerk treasurer's responsibility. I think it's the village manager,
Well, who does the village manager report to?
the board of trustees.
And we learned last week that it's actually the manager's office that has the DMS account.
Correct.
Augie
All
is
right.
going to make that clear. So let's do another reminder tomorrow.
All right. I will table my indignance for the moment. Any other are there any issues that need to be added to the agenda this evening, other than those that are listed? If not, let's go to the.
Wait.
Yes?
Sorry, I was wondering if we heard back from Joe Mancini yet.
That's the first item on my notes, Brian. So your timing is good. You mean regarding the statute of limitations on?
Yes.
Yes, that's the first item of the agenda. The answer is no.
All right.
In other words, we're going to my notes, and I've got there at the head of the notes the fact that
Sorry about that.
I'm still waiting to hear from John.
Okay.
So I will follow up on that. The next item, if we go to page 4, for definitions, village consultant. I have As I indicated in the notes, I believe we agreed that the definition should be consistent with what we're referring to as the VOBEC definition. So I basically copied and pasted it. At some point, we will have to address the issue of who gets included in the general definition of who's covered by the code, and whether we use an acronym or whether we simply repeat the title names throughout the code, or if there's anybody else, any other category of individual we should bring in. Any comments on that change that I made there? Okay. So let's now go to page 1112. Distribution and posting of the Code of Ethics. I provided that the code is to be distributed on the second Monday of January, which is what we agreed. And there it is on top of page 12. And what I don't think we addressed was a deadline for the recipients to acknowledge receipt and understanding of the code, which says all recipients shall acknowledge in writing that they have received, read, and understand or understood, we'll fix it, the Code of Ethics. Does it not seem logical that we should put in a date by which recipients are required to respond? And if we're using electronic forms of communication, it should be easier.
I agree. We should include a date. In my mind, 30 days or the second Monday in February is sufficient. However, if we do that, then I think we need to add a section about the village manager needs to follow up, also known as chase, those who have not acknowledged. And then we have to address some potential recourse.
And for failure to file, some kind of sanction or suspension, something like that.
Something, because otherwise it's just a statement that has absolutely no teeth, no ramifications. And by default, that implies it's not important.
Any other comments on that?
I just, to be consistent, I know last time, I agree with you, Ellen. I just get concerned when we cross over into the management aspect with, the manager or, anybody in Village Hall, and we start imposing a penalty there. I just rather have their comments there. The one thing I do think is we shouldn't do this for 30 days. I would do a much shorter time frame, 10 or 15 days at the most.
The reason why I said 30 was people might be on vacation. For the DPW, we could be having snowstorms. They're all doing overtime because it's January. So that's the only reason why I said 30 days. I agree
get
with
it, but
it's a 20-minute read.
I just go back to what you say with the chasing. And if we
Yep.
start at 30 days, then the chasing gets to 60 days, and then how far down? So at least at 10 days, the chasing can begin there. And then within 30 days, there would be an expectation that, okay, you've been told 3 times, you've got to acknowledge it. So I would hear what you're saying. And I've been one to chase. So
Yep.
I know what that's like. I would rather we start with a shorter time.
That's fine. I have no problem with that. But I think we need to back this blurb up.
I agree.
All right, I'll work on that. Having been a chaser and a chasee, I can tell you that it's annoying when you don't get it, but I've also seen in uh, companies tremendous leeway because they acknowledge, as I think, as Ellen pointed out, that you've got people doing lots of other things. So I'll work with that, see what I can come up with as a suggested language. I also like the idea of asking getting an opinion from the village manager on what their view of this is, because we're giving them the responsibility.
Yeah, and I just want to put one more thing out there that, remember, once they read this the first time, in theory, this isn't going to change a whole heck of a lot. And maybe what we do is recommend that any changes that might happen during the year are put to the front of the email of the document so that they see exactly what it is. And that
That's
if
next
there are
time.
no changes, it's just a strict, hey, this is an identical document that you read and certified to last year. You know, it's for you to review and ensure that you're up.
Okay. All right. Under we discussed distributing to employees along with the code, the state general municipal law sections that are posted publicly. I think John raised this last week. We can add this, but I think we need a fuller discussion on whether we are giving our employees both the Village of Mamaroneck Code, and we're also saying, hey, read this too. This is
I don't-
the state.
I don't think we need to. Because I think we've made sure that what's in the state law is in our code.
Any other views on that?
I don't think we have to provide it. I mean, there's a responsibility to know the law. I agree with Ellen. Everything is.
Yeah, I agree. I'm reluctant to pile on the paper and have people acknowledge all of this stuff. I think the code alone is sufficient.
So Brian, since we're in a democracy, what's your vote? And it will be 4-1 or 4-2. What-
I mean, I'd rather wait until the whole committee to decide anything. Just to
Okay,
get more viewpoints on it.
All right, I'll leave it in. I'll leave it in the notes so that we'll mark it as something that the fuller committee should address.
I mean, I guess it's a good idea.
To distribute both. Right, it's in their interests to do so.
right,
Yeah,
but
I
if,
mean, so
I-
no one
I
can
just-
be like, so no one could just be like, oh, I didn't know. It's like.
right, but if we've already incorporated the state law into the village code, it's redundant. So I'm not sure what the benefit is. That's all I'm saying.
It doesn't hurt. If we want to put a link there for them to review and take a look at it. But I just think mandating the review of the village code is what's important. And if they choose to go further, they
Yeah.
I mean, where we stop, you go into the penal law, you go into the federal code. These are all things we've talked about for people who have problems or violations. So I think if we just stay right on the village code where it's at, and we can provide whatever other link we want to.
We can make sure it's on the village. It's on the village site too. And we can just furnish it to them. What we're requiring is an understanding of the code of ethics. We're not necessarily requiring an understanding of the municipal law. So we can provide that the municipal law is distributed along with the code, but what we're asking for acknowledgement of is an understanding of the code.
I won't have it done by next week, but I will take a look at the posting from the state and do a comparison against our code to see if there's anything we've missed.
That would be great.
Yeah. But I'm not committing to a date. I'm in all these budget meetings and reviews and stuff, so
No, that's fine. Tomorrow is fine, Ellen.
I'll do it tonight.
Great. Okay. Page 14. Okay. I've reworded this section to make the Board of Ethics the sole body authorized to bring a complaint. I think that was the consensus from our discussion with Mr. Fusco and Ms. Roberts.
Well, I think also, they were saying that they don't really vet any of the information. So I'm not even sure that they'll do the comparison, for the omits material information, if they do a comparison versus prior year. They just do a look to make sure all questions are answered. So
Okay.
I don't think the village clerk treasurer office would ever be determining a misstatement or an omission. That's what I got out of the meeting.
Yeah, I
Okay.
left it, I get that. I left it in there, Ellen, because it does not impose a duty upon them. And I doesn't necessarily presume that they are examining these statements for misstatements or omission. But I'll hear the view of others as to whether it is misleading or it should come out.
To me, it's not giving ownership of that review to either group. And that's my issue with that or. Clerk treasurer or the Board of Ethics. Board of Ethics could say, oh, I thought the clerk treasurer reviewed it.
I mean, my concern is just like putting the village clerk treasurer in like an awkward position that like the Board of Ethics should be doing.
Yep.
I think it should just be the Board of Ethics. Like, I think the village clerk treasurer should just pass the disclosure along.
My fear is how much work can we put onto volunteers and how many of these documents will there be? And I know we take these jobs on voluntarily. I don't want to create a scenario where there's too much work and then because of that, there's no expectation that they could do the job that's necessary. If it is with an employee, and I'm not minimizing that they have other roles, but to make adjustments to that so that this important. Like how many documents did we say would there be coming in?
I don't remember how many disclosures. It was a healthy list.
Yeah, and so, should we be putting that on to volunteers? And again, I know they volunteer. I just think when it gets to that point, it's much.
Someone's got to read it. I mean, if someone's got to read it, and even if there's a field in the form that is omitted and should be included, not presuming there to be something that is falsely or wrongly stated, someone's got to read it and say, you didn't fill this in. And that is, to me, an administrative function that falls to the village clerk treasurer. And go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. I was going to make a suggestion, which might make it easier then. If on the disclosure statement itself, at the bottom, after they've answered all the questions, has any information changed from prior year? And if the answer to that is no, that makes the review much easier.
Someone's still got to read it.
Yeah, I agree. Dan, I'm with you on this. I would tend to agree that it should be somebody, an employee. I just don't think we should say specifically which one, that the assignment of responsibilities should come from the board. You just note to the board review that we think there should be an employee of high stature.
Yeah, I agree. It should not be a volunteer Board of Ethics member, fellow citizen who's reading disclosure statements and then makes a complaint to their next, to a neighbor, I think it has to have the imprimatur of a city official, village official who says, you left something out, you got to fill it out again. And hearing that they don't even read these things is of concern to me.
I think that the ethics board meets to review them. I think that's why, I think the ethics board does meet to review them. That's one of the things that they do, because they sometimes notify people if the documents aren't complete, or if there's a question on the document, or certainly if it hasn't been done. So I think the ethics board's doing it now, and maybe that's a question for them.
Really?
I believe that's what we were told when we met with the ethics board.
And I know in bigger municipalities, like the county has someone else that does it, but I don't know that, I'm not sure that that's.
Yeah, I didn't recall that from the meeting, but if that's the case and there is precedent now for the board doing it, maybe then the board does it.
I mean, I thought that was part of the Board of Ethics job, was review these.
I think it's a time-consuming part of their job, and I think that because, we were not having as many meetings January, February, and March, because we were trying to sort of save a little bit on staff overtime, that in fact the ethics board was meeting during the day so that there wouldn't be staff overtime so they could do this. So I think that they've been working on that in the last couple months. So maybe reach out to them.
Them who?
At the ethics board.
Somebody want to take that on?
I'll do it, Dan, but you know what? I'll call and speak to the chair of the ethics board and ask him to report back.
Thank you.
And just so I'm clear, the parameters of our inquiry are you reviewing this? How thorough do you believe they're being reviewed? And do you believe you are the best group to do this, right?
I think so, yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
All right, I just don't want to go too far afield in a call.
Yeah, and I'm also comfortable calling Mark Ettinger and asking him about precedent on that. All right, that's very good. Let us go to 6. Page 15. The dreaded section 2172. What I've done there is I have plugged in the town of Harrison, and we've been over this, as I said in my notes, we've been over this several times. I think my view is the best way to resolve this, as it may be with some other issues, is to tell the Board of Trustees when we make our final report that there are a lot of points of view on this. And maybe we leave it to them to decide whether it stays the same or changes.
Yep. I think that's a good idea.
It's unlikely that this is going to be a real situation, but here's another suggestion, and that is putting in a provision to the effect that, and this would address Mike's concern, is that if a Board of Ethics member seeks to appear as part of their job before any governmental entity, that they need an opinion, they need the approval of the Board of Ethics to do that. That's not necessarily a for now discussion, but it's something to consider. And that would mean it's sort of a compromise, meaning that it's not a complete bar. And it even opens the door. Well, I don't know that it opens the door, but it's not a complete bar, but it enables, if somebody indeed, as part of their job, wants to appear before some body in the city of Rochester, New York, they go to the Board of Ethics and say, look, I've got this application before the board for my company, and is it okay if I do that?
Dan, and I'm sorry, I don't think I said any. I said those that had oversight over the Village of Mamaroneck that would overlap. Somebody who's appearing in, Erie County for something that has no connection to the village, I don't think is material. Just my concern all along was the original code separated out the Village of Mamaroneck and the town of Rye, right? And we left out the county and the state without even recognizing, as you did last week, that, this, waterworks, right? So I would limit it to those that have oversight for anything within the Village of Mamaroneck, a government entity that has oversight in the Village of Mamaroneck.
So I'm not sure I quite understand your comment, Mike.
The original code said the town of Rye or the town of Mamaroneck.
Right,
I would imagine it's because those are the two towns that the village overlaps.
right.
My initial point was, well, because there could be conflict there within those two government jurisdictions. Well, why not the county or the state that also overlaps in appearing there on a matter that might have an impact in the village? I, for one, don't care what's happening in Rochester or Buffalo. But
Okay,
we've identified these two jurisdictions, and then you brought in, rightfully so, that, hey, the joint waterworks, right? And that has a direct impact on the village also. So I'm just recognizing the town of Rye and the town of Mamaroneck aren't the only two political jurisdictions that the village of Mamaroneck has interactions with. I think if we're going to identify those two, we should identify the others.
okay. Now I think it was John who mentioned the waterworks, which, as far as I know, was just a property on the monopoly board that I would occasionally buy. Is there, does the town of Harrison, does that take in the waterworks, or is the waterworks something that has to be mentioned separately? Anybody know?
The waterworks is with Harrison.
Okay, so let's leave it the way it is, if that's okay with everyone, and we'll pass this one on to the Board of Trustees to figure out at some point.
If we could just add to that,
Yeah.
I don't believe that this list is that large when we actually put it down. Right, you're only talking another couple of, entities, right? And if we could close this with, or any other agency that may have business with the Village of Mamaroneck, or just remove it entirely. For me, I just don't see the sense of just these two.
So, all right, tell me, would you say again what that suggestion is?
We recommend to the board that this list, the additional political jurisdictions, in addition to the town of Rye and town of Mamaroneck, shouldn't be that many, right? And that we find conflict here, or at least I do. Some of the members find conflict that we've only identified two of these jurisdictions. There might be others. Again, as John says, the waterworks is a classic example. We've identified the town of Rye, but not waterworks.
All right, so we can, are you saying that we identify those jurisdictions, or state to the board that they should consider that there are other jurisdictions that might have an impact?
We could do both and just recommend, look, there are additional jurisdictions such as the county and the state and waterworks. How about the school districts, right? That, have a similar or greater impact on the Village of Mamaroneck than, say, the town of Rye.
Okay. All right, I think we will draft language, alternative language, and at the time at which we sign off on this proposed code, we can then decide what goes into what we say about this particular section.
Do you think we'll ever get to the point where we sign off?
Oh, yeah.
Only joking.
Yeah, yeah, no, we're making,
Can I ask a different question? What kind of format are we sending? We can't send it with all these changes because we put in, we took out. I mean, this is a mess.
what I have in mind is sending them a tracked change, we'll take the original code that we were given in its form. Track changes, the changes that we're proposing. In other words, illuminate in red the changes we're making, and then also send them a code in final form as it would appear if all of our changes were adopted. So they can go section, and there will be a narrative. So we'll go indicate what we've proposed, what we're changing, explaining everything from definitional changes to taking out the his's and hers, which I think we should do. And I have in mind something which will be a good concordance, something that you'll be able to see what changes are, and we'll explain why we're making the changes. We can do that in a separate report. And of course, ultimately what we'll do is presumably meet with the Board of Trustees at some point. It probably couldn't be done in one meeting.
I agree, Jen. They're gonna have to review this and then sit and have their notes and ask us why we come to some of these.
Yeah, so I'm not worried about the format in which it's presented.
I was just curious. Because here, we put stuff in, we've taken it out, so it gets a little crazy.
Yep. It's going to look great.
Okay, I trust you.
It's going to look even better than Magna Carta. Okay.
The Mamaroneck Carta.
Excellent. Right. All right. Section 6. I've changed this section to provide that the filing alone of the change in party registration is what effectuates all of the consequences of changing party registration, which Nora pointed out to us that the change in registration is not official. This takes months to be effectuated. Here, I've changed it so the filing itself is the consequential act. And I've also down here indicated that it constitutes a removal of from membership on the board rather than using the term vacator. I looked up vacator and it's no longer in New York state law. It's the term used is removal. So I've changed that. Okay, page 19.
Hey, Dan, can I just go back to that one section again, just real quickly? And that's just calling removal of office, right? And do we want to put in there that the removal of the office may not be the only penalty imposed here? So
Right.
if somebody changed and then continued on and this was undiscovered and had an impact on whatever decisions that they were before then, I would just want it to be recognized, hey, removal from office, not the only remedy here, right? That you may be subject to additional discipline.
Make it a violation of the code of ethics for failing to file, failing to notify.
Yeah.
Right, so what are you recommending, Mike? What additional ramification?
I don't know. I just wouldn't want to be in a scenario where, yes, this person didn't notify, and then this was viewed down the road. Well, his only discipline was removal from the board.
No, I get that. I'm just not sure what the other disciplinary action would be.
Any punishment that would be imposed, based on similar conduct or as the board sees fit. Like, what do we want there again? Not that they're removed from office. We want them to comply with the code. And when
Correct.
people don't comply with code, certainly the first action is we want them separated from any decisions. But the other action is, hey, if they violated the code, what is the possible sanction? And I don't want somebody to interpret that down the road, that the only sanction was removal from the board.
It's a fair comment. We can put in language to the effect that failure to file could constitute a violation of the code of ethics.
I wouldn't use the term could. I would say does constitute a violation of the Board of Ethics, and then allow those who determine, how serious, to figure that out.
All right, I'll plug in, subject to any comment by anybody else. I can plug that in and we'll see how it shapes up, what it looks like. All right, let's go to uh, 19. 21-14B. Okay. Oh, that's back to the, no, we're not going to discuss this tonight. This is yet another section. I'm talking about the fine here, but this is another section we're going to have to punt to the Board of Trustees. I think we're going to come to an agreement on this, a common agreement on this, unless anybody wants to discuss it further. Okay, let's go to page 23. All right, there was language here under C regarding the distribution of the code of ethics. It's redundant, so I took it out. It's in an earlier section. And I narrowed the provision, the comments made by Mr. Fusco and Ms. Roberts regarding whether the code needed to be distributed to everyone, all of the many vendors. I narrowed it to a provision requiring distribution of the code to situations where there's an RFP, bids and awarded contracts. It's buried here in the purple. The village manager shall attach a copy of the code of ethics or provide an electronic link to the code of ethics to every request for proposal or solicitation for bids issued by the village manager's office. Each awardee of a contract with the village shall confirm in a written reply receipt of the code and that the awardee has read and understood the contents of the code. I think that makes it realistic in so far as what their concerns were and what our goal is.
So I have a question on this whole section.
Yeah.
After our discussion about it last week, I was talking to a friend of mine who is a contractor and does do some work occasionally for the village. So I asked him his opinion. And he has no issue reading the code of ethics and signing that he read it and so on and so forth. But he said to me, why? We're not employees of the village. What is it, while I'm doing a construction job, what is it that I could possibly do to violate the code of ethics? What's the point of this? And I really couldn't answer him.
You could take the mayor to dinner, a very expensive dinner, and say, I hope you like the work we're doing for you. We're going to be a little late on the contract. I'm sure you understand that's okay. And by the way, I have field box level tickets to the Mets.
All right,
Or separate from the mayor, an employee
Sure,
who's responsible for the oversight.
sure. Yeah, it's
but, okay, let's go to that though, Mike. The employee responsible for the oversight is the one who should be complying with the code of ethics and not let any gifts or, the whole gift section.
No, absolutely. But I don't think it's wrong to hold the vendors to the same level, right? Suppose the vendor attempts some unethical behavior or illegal behavior, and it is rejected by the employee. Should the vendor escape some sanction? Should the vendor continue to do business with us?
All right, fair enough.
Yeah, it's really important because I'll give you the example of I've given you before. The Kmart had 5,000 vendors, and many of them were just hammering the employees, the buyers, with offers of everything. And we decided the vendors had to know, full stop, that it was wrong to even make the offer. You're only getting half the job done when you educate the employees. You have to educate the vendors too.
All right, I just didn't know how to answer the question, so now I know.
Okay. Okay. Believe it or not, we are now through the sections of the code that we've identified as requiring attention. And what I would like to do at this point is, first of all, is there anything we've missed that needs to be addressed, any section? We can raise it now, raise it at a future meeting. I hope we'll all review everything we've done so far. And if there's something we've missed, a definition, a section, bring it up and we can discuss it. Also, I want to go back and look at our conversations with Tom Murphy, with Mark Ettinger, with Ms. Goldstein, and anyone else who has communicated with us or will communicate with us, and see if their recommendations, we've addressed some of them already, to see if there are recommendations we've missed or need to take up and go over. And then I have on page 3 of my notes some suggestions about changing some definitions or adding some definitions here in order to conform those to what I've read in the model codes. Before I get there, is there any other agenda item or any section or any comment anyone has regarding the code that we should address at this moment? Okay. In the absence of that, and by the way, next week we have Mr. Spolzino meeting with us, the village council, legal counsel. And the timing is good because we're almost through our work. And the goal of that meeting in part is to raise with him some sections and see if we have made any provisions which conflict with village law that we're not familiar with or with New York state law. So that's one of the goals there. The definition section, these definitions appear in the model ethics law published in Municipal Ethics in New York, which is the volume I frequently have used. And I favor including these provisions. I'm putting them in summary form. I put them in summary form rather than putting them in the draft, to get an understanding from as to what your view is of them. So the first is the term appear and appear before. And I go to see if we have appear. I don't know that we even define appear. These are the sections where I don't even think we define appear. So this would insert a definition, means communicating in any form, including without limitation, personally, through another person, by letter, mail, facsimile, or by telephone. And that would clarify the term that we use in several places, in at least 11 places in the Code of Ethics here. So we would now be defining it. Any views on that? And as I pointed out, it's in the model code. All right, and none of this, I'm not taking silence as consent. I think, give it some thought. At some point, I do want to bring it up before the all of us and have get a vote on it. Confidential information, and this would expand the current definition to include any information prohibited from disclosure by federal or state law. Then customer or client. And here I've provided a little more specific definition. And let me see if I've got customer here anywhere. Yeah. The definition here, a person from whom or to whom, and this is mine, I think I stuck this in, or business entity from which or to which a village employee or officer receives payment or makes payment of more than $500 a year or has oral or written agreement to do so. And I've expanded this definition in the notes. I've raised the number to $1,000 and provided more definition on this. Any person or entity to whom or to which a VOBEC or employee has supplied goods and services during the previous 12 months in the aggregate of having a value of greater than $1,000. Any person or entity to which the VOBEC or the VOBEC's employer or business has supplied goods or services during the previous 24 months, having in the aggregate a value greater than $1,000, but only if the VOBEC knows or had reason to know the outside employer or business supplied the goods or services. Again, I'll ask you to read it and let's think about that. I think it needs to be addressed. Then there is
Are you reading from something that, like, I'm not seeing it on my screen here?
my notes. I sent
Okay.
you my notes via email.
Oh, God, sorry, I can open it up on another page. I apologize.
Yeah, that's where I have it. And then this is something which appears in one of the model codes. And it essentially, the purpose of introducing this definition called ministerial act would permit one of the categories of employees, consultants, et cetera, to appear on their own behalf to obtain an ordinary service such as a variance or license, or obtain any service or benefit generally available to the public. So it essentially removes the concern that one of the designated parties is getting some sort of special treatment just because they're getting a fishing license from the village.
Where would we include that? I
In
agree that it's needed,
Definitions.
right, but where would that be referenced? Throughout the document is my point. Or you don't think we need it referenced?
I don't think it needs to be referenced.
Okay,
Well, I'll look at that further. I'll go back and look at it. It may need some more context.
I mean, I understand where you're coming from and I agree with it, the sentiment,
Yeah.
but I don't know if it will just be a definition flapping in the wind for no reason.
Yeah. All right, I'll look at it again and see if I can provide some context to it. Okay, we have been through that's all I have on the agenda for this evening. Are there any other subjects that we need to discuss? If not, then we have our meeting with Mr. Spolzino next week, which I'm assuming will take at least half the meeting, if not more. And I would like to have some discussion on these model law sections that I've mentioned, and I'll put that in my memo for next week. And then I think after that, it's a discussion if there's anything of some of the proposals that have been made to us, I indicated before. So we could be, this is March. We could be writing and editing as early as mid-April, perhaps early April.
Dan, can I just make a suggestion, given that we have him coming next week? If it's possible, we could extend the meeting an extra 15 minutes. If we have to notice that out, or whatever else do, tell all the rest of the board members, just to give us a little more time.
I'm sorry, would you say that again? I don't think I understood, Mike.
I just want to extend the meeting next month and next week, instead of ending at 7:30 after an hour, just so we all know, hey, look, we're going to have a little longer meeting.
If that's okay, that I can put out, I can note it in the, I mean, it's fine with me.
It's fine with me.
Me too.
When the meetings are noticed, they just have a start time. They don't have an end time. So,
Okay, we've been pretty much staying to this hour,
right.
and I just, for next week, maybe we can just go for an extra 15 minutes.
Well,
That's
as long as we have a quorum, we can go.
Have a host.
You're critical, Nora.
A pandemic skill.
Okay, any other subject to come up? If not, entertain a motion to adjourn.
Make a motion.
Second,
Second,
any discussion on the motion? If not, all in favor signify, please.
aye.
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 Meeting is adjourned. Thank you all very, very much. Have a safe week. The weather is changing, I think. We got some great weather coming up. We'll be in touch, and see you all next week.
Thanks, Dan.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good night.